Once, in some context that I don't exactly recall, Swami Kriyananda made reference to the story of the life of Jesus as the greatest story ever told. And he has trained me to be a wordsmith, and so I listened to those exact words. And I said, really, Swamiji, would you say that about Jesus' life, the greatest story ever told? And Swami's entire demeanor in his answer completely shifted. And just like a child with his eyes wide, he said, yes, don't you think so? And it was a reminder to me of how many different dimensions there are on the spiritual path. One side is this enormous philosophical story. Our reading today is a little bit about this. Who was the Son of Man? What did it mean to be lifted up? And then this great verse from the Gita of all these transcendent ways of thinking. And yet on the other side, I'm so sorry, I'm still having trouble with my voice. And then on the other side, we have this extraordinary adventure of one individual's incarnation. A master, yes, but nonetheless one individual. In another context, Swami commented when he was writing about Master's life and so on, which is one of the assignments he had from his guru to do, was he said at a certain point he lamented that by comparison to Jesus especially, Master's life was really quite undramatic. He did have obstacles, there were betrayals, he had money challenges and occasional persecution and lawsuits and things like that. But compared to the life of Jesus, it really wasn't the greatest story ever told. And Swami said at first he lamented that a little bit because in writing about the life of Master, Swami had intended to be a playwright before he found the spiritual path. And there wasn't a lot of material to work with, or not as much material as you could for Jesus. But then he began to say later, he said that the real message of Master's life, the reason the incarnation itself didn't have those kinds of dramatic incidences, was so that the emphasis would be more on the teaching. Because as we're coming into Dwapara Yuga, people are able to understand more subtly. We don't understand just from stories. We also understand from principles and ideas. But nonetheless, all of us are completely captivated by stories. A few days ago, I went to visit a friend and her 4-year-old son. The parents had to leave for a moment and I was alone with the boy. And he turned to me and he said, "Tell me a story. I love stories." And it was just so sweet to just see how his heart and energy, this all plays into Swami Kriyananda's education for life, which is you work with the flow of energy that the children have. But the fact of the matter is we all love stories. And the life of Jesus is the greatest story ever told in many, many ways. And at the time he was coming, which was Kali Yuga descending, when the consciousness of the planet was not subtle, the example had to be dynamic and unmistakable and had to endure through a period of great darkness when the barbarians literally burned all the libraries, literally. The idea and the power of his life had to endure. It couldn't endure just with subtle ideas. There had to be something that everyone could see. And Master coming back to America in 1920, born into this world in 1893 in India, his mission was to bring clarity of the high teachings of the East and the traditions of the West, the life of Krishna, the life of Jesus, and to understand how all of it rolls together. And in that way, he brought out many aspects of the story of the life of Jesus, which I want to share with you, some of them, including the so-called lost years. Everything that I share with you is how Master explained Jesus' life, which I accept as a valid interpretation of it. Jesus' life was anticipated. The place into which he was born and the group into which he was born is recognized now as the Essene community. And what the Essene community is very relevant. It's relevant also to the reality that we're living right now, which is the entire culture around the Essenes, the Roman culture and all the others were pagan in the sense that they didn't understand the transcendent reality of spirit. They had forgotten the principles of Sanatana Dharma, of Satchidananda, of ever-existing, ever-conscious new bliss, of which all of us are manifestations, and the purpose of our life is to become perfect channels of Satchidananda. All true religions, one way or another, express this. Moses was a true master. His teaching was identical to all the true religions of all times, uniquely expressed for that time and place. But as happens, the revelation of the master is there, and gradually lesser minds begin to interpret it according to what they understand, sometimes with nefarious, self-serving purpose, sometimes innocently, but simply limited in what they know. And of that whole pagan world, the Jewish culture still retained this relationship to the highest truth. But the Jewish culture itself was divided between what can only be called a corrupt priesthood, whether they were Jews or Christians or Muslims or Zoroastrians or Pharisees, Parsis, it just doesn't matter. Corrupt priesthood is corrupt priesthood. It just doesn't matter. It's where people use something for power and for money. And so Judaism, which was still a true faith, was divided in half. And most of that had become concentrated in the Essene community, which was somewhat underground and somewhat secret, because all the power and the authority was in the hands of the corrupt priesthood. But the Essenes and all that represented of truth knew that there was going to be a tremendous shift in everyone's understanding. They anticipated through intuition and prophecy that there would be this great master who would come. So when Jesus was born, his birth was anticipated, and all the myths, the stories that have become like myths of the remarkable things that happened when he was born was all based on something. Whether they're now just beautiful tales or exactly what they are. But Master Yogananda did say that the gurus of the East, in fact, the very gurus of our line, Babaji, Lahiri, and Sri Yukteswar, were the three wise men who came from India to pay homage to this incarnation, which they knew was one of them in the sense of being a self-realized master, and apparently one of them in this greater sense of responsibility for the planet. So when Jesus came, there was this great rejoicing because he was going to be the messenger with the power that was going to restore the high reality that was the truth of life as this segment understood it. And they nurtured him and they raised him. And that's how the Bible describes it until the age of 12. When Jesus separates himself from his parents, they all go on pilgrimage to Jerusalem. The parents go back to their home, but Jesus just stays in the temple there. And his parents are quite alarmed because they consider him quite young. They don't even realize he's not with them because it's a huge caravan traveling together. They just assume he's with some other segment. They finally realize he's not there. They rush back to Jerusalem. He's sitting in the temple as if this was his place. And he's discussing with the rabbis, and the rabbis are listening to him. He's answering their questions. The people are amazed that one so young would be so wise. His parents come and say, "Why did you not come home with us?" And his answer is so profound. He said, "Don't you know that I must be about my Father's business? Not my Father, my earthly Father, but my Father in heaven. This is what I was born for." And even though the Bible doesn't go into it at great length, it's that extraordinary blend between high awareness and human attachment. So he accepts the order to go back with his parents, but shortly after, the entire biblical account stops. And there's whole stories about that I won't bother to say, but Yogananda's explanation is very simple. That was the point at which Jesus began his own sadhana. Because masters, even though they come with full self-realization, also demonstrate for us what it is to be a human being in this world, to live in accordance with God's plan. If a master never himself disciplined himself, longed for God, needed to make the effort, had the bliss of realization, what kind of an example would it be for the rest of us? Oh yeah, of course he can do it, but that doesn't have anything to do with me. Removing these years from the life of Jesus completely confused his teachings and his example. But the fact of the matter is, and as Yogananda put it, Yogananda said, Master said, that in fact they were making plans to marry Jesus at that point, to get him a wife and a family and have him settle down. How that reconciles with everything else, I can't do it. But that's what Master said. And Jesus said, I'm having none of this. And he joined a caravan to India and just left. And for 18 years, he was gone. The Bible is silent about it, so we don't really know what happens, because many of those who later became Jesus' disciples were his cousins, members of the community, people that he knew. So it's very hard to imagine that he just disappeared without any contact with any of these people. So who knows, maybe some of his disciples went with him. Maybe they joined him later. Maybe he returned to teach them. But for approximately 18 years, he went to the Himalayas. He rejoined the masters, Babaji and the other masters there, and he did the sadhana that he needed to do. And then even more than that, he had a mission in India. He traveled around. Varanasi, Puri are two of the places that are often mentioned, plus many of the northern sites up in the mountains. Jesus was a recognized great master. He argued with the traditionalists and tried to get them to be more liberal in the way that they were thinking. He was not popular there either, because that's what he did. But he was born for this particular mission to the Essene community and to that whole world and ultimately to the West. So after 18 years of that, he goes back. And the Bible has him just popping up again. He disappeared and then he popped up again. Some hundreds of years after Jesus died, the church council just took all of that out. Because by that point, their idea of what it meant to be a self-realized master had become so confused, they thought, and these are the exact words that Master uses, that it would lessen people's faith to think that Jesus had to study with anyone. Others argued, the disciples knew about it and it didn't seem to bother them, but the church authorities had their opinion, so they just lifted that part out of the Bible. As Swamiji said, they had the nerve to take it out, but didn't have the nerve to recreate a new biography. So it just disappeared. So Jesus appears again. And now he's a grown man. Now it's not a question of asking his parents' permission. Now he has all the authority of his time with his own masters, and he's commissioned for this, what turns out to be 3.5 years, which is a very, very tiny period of time. So Jesus just comes onto the scene like a comet. And he gathers up his disciples, which made me wonder, is this the first time they've seen him in 18 years? What about all of their training? What about the power that they needed? What about their own relationship with all of the other masters? But none of that is filled in, and I certainly can't fill any of it in. But Jesus walks in, and Jesus has one purpose. He's going to create this extraordinary wave of energy that is going to endure till now. And a great master, every great self-realized master, every self-realized master has the same state of consciousness, but they have a mission. And they have a mission that is related to the time in which they're born, to the energy that it's going to launch for the generations to come. And they have a very specific mission to their own disciples. In a way, you look at this cosmic influence that they have, and then you also realize that they come individually for every one of those souls that they have been moving forward for many incarnations. In our class Conversations with Yogananda, the excerpt that we recently read was where Swamiji speaks of his fellow disciple, Norman Paulson. And Norman had had a vision of himself, Norman, as Yogananda's disciple in Lemuria, which is one of these ancient civilizations approximately 80,000 years ago. And Norman saw himself as Yogananda's disciple, which, as Swami said, was interesting. Swami's not particularly interested in Lemuria. He said the question it raised in his mind was, how long does this take? And so he said to Master, Have I been your disciple for thousands of years? And diplomatically, Master answers, it's been a long time, that's all I'll say, like this. And Swamiji says, how can it take so long? And Master says, he says, desire for name, fame, and all the rest of them just takes you away again and again and again. And so, but once that bond is formed with the Guru doesn't abandon us. Master's poem about returning, when I am only a dream, and I will return, maybe that, God's Boatman, that's the poem I mean, where Master says, again and again, 1 trillion times if necessary, I will come back as long as one stray brother is left behind. I mean, the human mind can't even begin to comprehend what that means. So the Masters have this responsibility for us. And so when they incarnate, their infinite consciousness is not in itself limited, but their expression of that consciousness becomes defined by the mission they have taken on, by the culture into which they have incarnated, and by the specific needs of all their disciples. So this life that Jesus lived was for the time, and the time was Kali Yuga descending. It had to be dramatic. There was no possibility of subtlety. It had to be an absolutely unmistakable demonstration of a power and a courage and a detachment and an unconditional love that was beyond anything, that nobody could miss. We're not going to be able to talk subtleties here. We're going to have to make it with power like this. So Jesus knows. Jesus has been in India for 18 years. He doesn't have to come back. There's nothing of his own, but he has this last task to carry out. His whole incarnation was 33 years. It was very short. This last task, he has to go back to these disciples, and they have to do this together. So he gathers his disciples. This is what the Masters do. They don't always have their disciples with them all the way through. In the life of Ramakrishna, his disciples didn't come till the very end. They were young men, but he didn't meet them until the end of Ramakrishna's life. At a certain point in Ramakrishna's incarnation, he was an avatar in the 1800s, late 1800s in India. His body began to glow. This gold light started coming out of his body. The life of Ramakrishna it's just full of very odd things. And because of that, people started being attracted to him. You can imagine, someone sitting there, he's glowing. Attracts a lot of attention. Even in India, it made an impact. And crowds started gathering, but it was too soon. It wasn't time. And Ramakrishna himself was so ingenuous, so childlike in his relationship to his own life. He went up on the rooftop and he was praying to Divine Mother, and he started going like this, back inside, back inside, back inside. He drove the light back inside. It's not time yet, like this. So it was time now for Jesus to do what he came to do. So he gathered up all those who were waiting for him, spiritually waiting for him, the sheep that he was designed by God to find. He takes the shortcut, or he reroutes himself through Samaria to meet the woman at the well, who Master said was a disciple from the past who had fallen. And they have a discussion about water at the well, and he says, you drink from this well, and you're thirsty again, but if you drink from the well, the living water that I can give you, you'll never thirst again. She says, tell me about this water. He says, well, go get your husband, and then I'll tell you both. And she says, I have no husband. And Master explains this. This was a test of her readiness to be honest and to receive what he had to teach her, because she had fallen in the past. So he says to her, you're right, you have no husband, but you have had 5 men, and the man you live with is no more your husband than the others were. And of course, this is all about her, and she's told him nothing. And she realizes suddenly that she's in the presence of greatness. And he says to her, I bless you for your truthfulness. And Master tells this whole story that she was a straggler. Desire for name, fame, and all the rest of them had drawn her away, and he went to find her. And she then tells everyone, I met this great prophet at the well, and he promises us a water that we will never thirst again. And she becomes a spokesman for his teaching. He's picking up his disciples. But also he needed to take his disciples through this extraordinary experience of defiance of this corrupt power that was all around them. And all through his ministry, this very short ministry, there's this constant tension going. Because this corrupt priesthood sees in him, they sense his power and they see in him this enormous threat to what they're holding, because he's defying their laws. They control everyone by their rules and their regulations and the divine consequences. If you don't do this, if you don't pay this, if you don't follow this rule, everybody's under their sway. And because they seem to speak with this authority, people are afraid. But Jesus is not the slightest bit afraid. And even those who were in between, which is where the Essenes have been, standing behind him, they too have this defiant power. And this is where the conflict builds. But every time Jesus pushes it right to the edge of some kind of a conflict, up until this point, he always steps back. And his disciples, some understand his intuitive message, all of it understand it to an extent, but he seems to be in this position where he's going to become their king. He's going to not only throw off the corrupt priesthood, but throw off the Roman yoke that binds them all. And their minds are all mixed up between spiritual power, worldly power, physical power, military power, government power, money power. And they're all just trying to wend their way through it. Excuse me, does this sound a little like modern times to anyone? The stories are all the same. Thousands of years, name, fame, and all the rest of them. So Jerusalem is the source of where all this power is. But Jesus spends most of his time at the Sea of Galilee, the town of Capernaum. I traveled in Israel once in my life, and Israel's a very small place. There's the desert, there's the sea, there's this little village. You can drive across the whole place in a couple of hours. Even walking, it doesn't take you so long. Jesus does not hang out in Jerusalem, because Jerusalem is the power city owned by all of this priesthood, and every time he gets close to it, it becomes very dynamic. So he gathers his disciples in these beautiful settings. And when you come later this afternoon to hear the oratorio, there's beautiful songs about how he and his disciples live. But that's not their destiny. That's not Jesus' destiny. And so finally he feels this divine call. And that's today. This is Palm Sunday. This is the Passover season. And because of the big temple, everybody who's sincere goes and celebrates the Passover in Jerusalem as the holy city where the temple is and where the priests are. So is Jesus going to come and do that this year? Because by now he's raised Lazarus from the dead. He's really blown his cover. Everybody knows about him. Lazarus was resurrected in a very public way, does not live far from Jerusalem, and everybody knew Lazarus was dead. And now Lazarus is walking around and talking. And it's very, very disconcerting. Somewhere in the Bible, one of the priests says, we're not only going to have to kill Jesus, we're going to have to kill Lazarus. It's all very practical, you see. He has raised him from the dead. He's taken him out of a tomb. Everyone was standing there. Lazarus walks out of the tomb after 3 days of being in there, wrapped up in the winding sheets. And now he's sitting at his sister's table having dinner. I mean, it's a little hard to dismiss that, right? So now Jesus is right there. And so everybody is so agitated. Will he come? What's going to happen? Is it going to be the confrontation? The disciples think this is our moment. We're finally, what we feel and know about him is finally going to be manifested to everyone. And Jesus is acting as if that's true. He allows himself to ride into Jerusalem on the back of this donkey. He allows his disciples, and this is a very important point, because either by word or by consciousness, he could prevent it. But he allows them to do what they've always wanted to do, which is to sing his praises, sing out Hosanna to the Son of David, blessed he who comes in the name of the Lord. And not only are the disciples gathered in this, but everyone. An uplifted mob develops. And they talk about this. People are putting their coats down so he can walk across them, and they're stripping the branches from the trees and laying it down, because all of this is finally released. It's a magnificent moment. But who dreamed of the tragedy soon to unfold? Who dreamed that the Savior would be crucified through hate? Who could hear in all those cries what was really going to happen? Because even worldly power, even the greatest worldly power, sooner or later, what happens to it? There's this great, is it Ozymandias? I don't remember, the great pillar that's somewhere buried in the Sahara Desert that was erected by some great emperor. Look upon my lands and envy me. And now that great pillar is just buried in the midst of this desert. What worldly leader, what wealthy person, what person of political influence, just think of one who has left any enduring legacy. Glorious or horrible, while they are there, it's writing on water. It absolutely disappears. What endures? Buddha, Krishna, Ramakrishna, Rama, Chaitanya, Yogananda, Jesus. These are the only powers that endure. So yes, Jesus is showing them, this is my power. If you silence your voices, even the very stones will cry out. Creation itself will declare the presence of the divine. But then how he manifests that. He manifests that with humiliation, execution, death. The human mind just doesn't know what to make of it until 3 days later, which is next Sunday. When just like Lazarus, he walks out of the tomb. So that's where we are.